This is the third lesson in the series about landings. This lesson concerns specialty landings. The other two lessons in the series on landings covered standard landings in tricycle geared airplanes and tailwheel airplanes, respectively. Up until the point of your first solo, your instructor will probably focus on getting you to be proficient at standard landings. After your first solo, your instructor will introduce you to several different types of specialty landings, which will teach you some techniques to vary the standard technique to adjust to special circumstances that you may encounter occasionally. This lesson will cover 4 different types of specialty landings. First, I'll talk about dead stick landings, which is another name for a power off landing. Then I'm going to talk about a short field landing where we don't have obstacles to clear. Then a short field landing where we do have obstacles in the approach path. Finally, I'll talk about a soft field landing. Each of these address different types of special circumstances and different techniques that you might apply. The goal of covering these different specialty landings is to teach you how to modify that standard technique to account for different situations. So you may not end up doing any of these 4 techniques exactly that way for a particular airport. You may need to mix and match combinations of elements from these. Now we're going to move into some specialty landings where we're going to talk about variations on that standard technique I talked about earlier. The first one is a dead stick landing, which is a landing without power. We call it a dead stick landing even though it's the throttle that's dead, not the stick. So recall that in the standard landing, you were using the power to make adjustments to your descent angle. But if you don't have power, you need to use something else. The tool that's available to you is called a forward slip. You do a forward slip by lowering one wing and using the opposite rudder. Forward slips are more aggressive slips than side slips used for crosswinds. The increased drag that you get from the forward slip increases your descent angle, makes it a more steep descent. So the forward slip allows you to make a change in one direction. You can make your approach steeper, but you can't use a forward slip to make your approach shallower. So you need to fly the traffic pattern such that your nominal or intended descent angle is quite a bit steeper than your power on descent angle. In fact, it should be a little steeper than your power off glide. That means that you will be coming down at a faster descent rate on your final approach, and when you get into the round out, you'll need to use a little more back pressure in order to make that round out. After the round out, you'll be doing it exactly the same as you would have been doing for your standard landing, because you wouldn't have been using power during those phases anyways. So to illustrate this a little bit more, we're going to choose the same kind of aiming point as we did during our power on approach. We're going to choose a point that's a ways down the runway. However, we're going to aim to be at a much steeper descent angle than we were during our power on approach. We accomplish that by flying our traffic pattern a little differently. So if we're low on approach, we'll notice that the same way we did before. We'll notice that our aiming point appears to be moving up on the windscreen. But there's not really much we can do about it. If we're low on approach, then we're going to land short of that aiming point. That's why we selected an aiming point that was a ways down the runway, so that even if we're a little bit off, our landing will still occur on the runway. On the other hand, if we are high, then we'll notice that because our aiming point will appear to move down the windscreen, just like it did with the power on approach when we were high on that approach. We correct for that by initiating that forward slip, which increases the drag and makes our approach steeper. So the forward slip is a nice tool to have, even when you're doing a normal landing. If you are ever too high on approach by enough that you can't adjust simply by a reduction in power, you get all the way back to idle power and you're still too high, the forward slip is a good tool in your bag to be able to still continue that approach. Now let's talk about a short field landing. So recall that in our standard landing, our goal was to really take advantage of the excess runway we had available to give ourselves some robustness to power failure and to try and make the landing nice and smooth and comfortable, both for the airplane and for the occupants. When we don't have excessive runway, then we're going to need to give up something there. A short field landing, our goal is to get over an obstacle and then get ourselves stopped as close to the obstacle as we can on the runway. We want to minimize how much distance we cover in each of these phases of the landing. A short field landing has the same phases or elements as a standard landing. And during each phase, there's things that make it shorter. So during the final approach, which is the phase from just clearing the obstacle to the round out, the things that are going to minimize the distance we cover during that phase. First thing is how much we clear that obstacle by. If we clear the obstacle by 100 feet, then we're going to use more distance to get to the runway than if we cleared that obstacle by 10 or 20 feet. So we want to clear it by enough to give us a little margin of safety for imperfect technique or gusts or something, but no excessive amount. One thing that helps to accomplish that is to do a relatively shallow power on approach up to the point of the obstacle. And during that part of the approach, our aiming point won't be a point on the runway, but it'll be kind of an imaginary point 20 feet or 10 feet above the obstacle. And we'll make our adjustments based on that aiming point. Also, full flaps will help make our approach steep and idle power. So even if we're using power up until we get to that obstacle, we want to be at idle power once we've cleared the obstacle. And we'll want to use that forward slip that we learned about before from the dead stick landing. Some aircraft do not allow you to use full flaps and forward slip together. Some aircraft have limitations on doing that. So you need to know if you're in one of those aircraft and know which thing will be the most helpful to you. the full flaps or the forward slip. During the round out and the flare, the things that will minimize the length, the main thing is not having excess airspeed. If you have too much airspeed, then you get into that flare and you float and float and float. We want to avoid that situation. So in an ideal world, you would get to the point of starting your round out with barely enough speed to make that round out without stalling. In practice, you need a little margin. So gusts are one thing you obviously need margin for, but more importantly, none of us are perfect at maintaining our target speed. So we need a little margin to accommodate our pilot skill. For your private pilot check ride, the standard you're expected to meet is you have to be no more than 10 knots above your target speed and no more than 5 knots below your target speed. Before you go out and try landing at airports that really genuinely require short field techniques, you need to be much better than private pilot standards at controlling your airspeed on final. And then during the rollout, the thing that controls the length, one thing is no excessive airspeed at touchdown and effective braking. So most effective braking is usually by having weight off the wing and on the wheels. And you want to make sure to use brakes as much as necessary, but you don't, not so much that, especially in a tailwheel aircraft, not so much that you make it tip forward, but the more brakes you can use safely, the shorter that rollout will be. Now let's consider a variation on the short field landing where we don't have the obstacle. We have a nice clear approach path up to the runway, but the issue is that the runway itself is very short. So in this circumstance, our objective is to minimize the distance between the start of the runway and the point where we come to a stop at the end of our rollout. During your training and on your check ride, you'll simulate this situation on a nice long runway by selecting a point on the runway and pretending that that point is the beginning of the runway. So if you accidentally come down too soon, you won't be doing damage to the airplane. But in order to pass your check ride, you will need to be able to come down between the designated point and a point 200 feet beyond that. So the distance between the beginning of the runway and the point you stop has two components. The first is the distance between the beginning of the runway and the point that you touch down. The keys to minimizing that length, you want to fly your approach with no excessive airspeed so that you minimize the distance that you will float. It's much easier to control how far you float if it's a small amount. You want full flaps because that's what will both minimize your speed and also put you in a high drag situation, so you'll bleed off that speed rapidly. It's helpful to make a shallow power on approach up to the point of your round out. That helps you predict the length of your round out and and get accurate on your aiming point a little bit easier than when you make a steep low power approach. During the rollout phase, the same things matter as on the other type of short field landing. You want to make sure you're touching down without excess airspeed and that you're using effective braking, which means retracting the flaps soon after your touchdown. Okay, now let's imagine that we're not worried about the length of the runway, but we're worried about the condition of the runway. Maybe it's tall grass or muddy or something that could grab the wheels. So our final approach and our round out, those are going to be the same as a standard landing. We'll want to use the full stall touchdown to keep our speed at landing as low as possible. So if we're in a tailwheel airplane, we're going to do a 3-point landing. And in nose wheel landing, we're going to do that full stall technique. If we add a little power right around the time of touchdown, that tends to make our touchdown a little bit lighter, a little bit more gentle, which helps with not having sudden drag on the wheels. During the rollout, we keep that back pressure on the stick or the yoke to keep as much weight on the wings and as little weight on the wheels as possible during the rollout. We don't want to do heavy braking. If you do heavy braking in a tricycle gear, that tends to push the nose wheel into the ground, and we really want to protect that nose wheel. And with tail wheel gear, braking increases the risks of us accidentally nosing over. So that wraps up the lesson on specialty landings. A few things that you should talk about with your flight instructor. First, ask your flight instructor if there are any airports in the area that you're doing your training in that would call for using short field techniques or soft field techniques. And ask if your flight school will allow you to go there with your instructor and have your instructor demonstrate these techniques at the kind of airport that actually requires them. It can look a lot different than when you're simulating short fields on a big long runway at your home airport. Talk to your instructor about how you would handle combinations of circumstances that called on you to pull together some elements from one type of a specialty landing with other elements from another type of a specialty landing. For example, what if you had an obstruction on the approach to the runway, but the runway itself was soft, not necessarily all that short? What kind of technique would work in that situation? And then as you get close to your check ride, have a conversation with your flight instructor about your personal limits for runway length. And as you gain experience, how should you go about adjusting those personal limits?